Hey folks, welcome to week 8 of DMD 105, Digital Design Foundations. How is everybody? Hope you're doing good. All right, so last week we started off with a new piece of software. We started playing around with Adobe Illustrator. Hopefully you guys have taken the past week to spend time playing around with the software, practicing with it, going over some of those introductory videos, and just sort of getting to know the general workspace and how the software works. Also, hopefully you have a good understanding of how it differs from Adobe Photoshop at this point. And so this week we are going to dive into some more specific tools and functionality in that software. All right, so let's go down here to our week 8 module. Take a look at the week 8 overview, see what's going on. So right here we have a selection of a different sort, which is our title for the week. Now we spent a lot of time in Photoshop going over selection tools, making those marching ants. And so those don't exist in Adobe Illustrator, but you do have other ways to select objects as well as pieces of objects. And so we are going to dive into those tools and how that works today. Now, before we do that, there is some consumables, some read, view, and listen stuff going on here. This is how to create and edit shapes with Adobe Illustrator, and this is directly from Adobe's website. This is a really great sort of how-to, and we went into this sort of a same how-to last week. There are some useful videos here that you can follow. There are files you can use in following the videos that you can download in advance. So these are really great tutorials broken up into multiple steps. I would definitely suggest following along with that. The other one here is the Transform and Edit Artwork lesson. And then this one here is the Changing Colors and Strokes lesson. So this is stuff we're also going to cover, but if you want to look at it from a different point of view, Adobe's little training videos here are fabulous. So I would definitely suggest using those to really expand your knowledge of Adobe Illustrator. Okay, tools we're going to look at today are the selection tool, the direct selection tool, the alignment and distribution palette, the pathfinder, and the color palette. Now, of these, the color palette is one you'll immediately be familiar with because it looks and acts almost identical to the one in Photoshop. Now, also this week, we are going to have a Vector Basics quiz, our third quiz of the semester, but you don't have to worry about that until the end of the week, until we've spent some more time getting to know Illustrator, so don't worry about that right now. And we are going to introduce Project 2 for homework this week, but again, we'll tackle that a little later in the week, so let's not worry about it right this second, okay? All right, so diving into Adobe Illustrator, let's take a look at it right here and see what is going on. Okay, so first let's take a look at the tools we're going to be focusing on today. So right here is the toolbar. We're going to close up on that. Let's minimize this so we can not get confused. So the toolbox, of course, like in Photoshop, can either be shown in one column or two columns, depending on how you like it. I happen to like two columns. I like the tools a little more visible this way. And the basic structure is exactly the same way. If you see a tool and it does not have a little arrow in the bottom, then it is a single tool by itself. If you hover over it for a second, it tells you what the tool is. And if you do see a little arrow in the lower right corner and you click and hold it, then there are adjacent related tools sitting underneath, okay? So same system as Photoshop. So today we're going to mostly look at the selection tool, which is the black arrow, the direct selection tool, which is the white arrow. We are also going to take a look at the shape tools, which are about 4 or 5 tools down on the left. If you hold it open, you can see that you can make rectangles, which of course you can also make squares. You can make rounded rectangles. You can make ellipses and circles. You can make polygons of a variety of different sizes with many different sides. You can make stars with a variety of different points. And for you Michael Bay fans, you can make a bunch of flares. I don't know why flare is even in here. There is a fair amount of functionality in Adobe Illustrator that is frankly just strange. And I think a flare tool is one of them. But anyway, we'll get into that as we go along. So those are the main tools we're going to use. Selection arrow, direct selection arrow, and the shapes. And then palettes, we are going to use our color picker, which you access the exact same way you get in Photoshop. The difference is in Photoshop, the two squares represent the foreground color and the background color. Here in Illustrator, the two squares represent the stroke color, meaning the outline of something, and the fill color, which of course is the color that the object is filled. Other than that, the color picker works kind of the same. You have the swap arrow, which allows you to swap the two colors back and forth. You have the default button in the lower left corner, which allows you to default to simply black and white. And of course, if you click on either of them, it opens up the color picker, which you'll notice looks almost identical to the one in Photoshop. You can choose only web safe colors to show just 216 different colors across the color wheel. You can uncheck that to show every color available through the color wheel, right? All 16 million colors. Inside the color selector, you can add lightness or darkness to make your color darker or lighter naturally. And the pure version of the color is in the upper right corner, which has no light or shadow applied to it. It's just simply the pure color from the color wheel itself. Meanwhile, you can input different color model percentages if you would like. There's the HSB model, the RGB model, the CMYK model, and the hexadecimal color model. RGB, CMYK, and maybe hexadecimal are the three that you would be using more often in real life. HSB is less common. And you can also access preset color swatches, which are already built into Illustrator here. Now you'll notice you can't access different types of pre-made colors like the Pantone colors or something like that you can access in Photoshop. So that is one difference between this color picker and the one in Photoshop. But other than that, they're pretty much exactly the same. Okay, other stuff we're going to use today, let's get the main software back on the screen here, is we're going to use a variety of palettes, including the Properties palette, which we pretty much always use. Last week I introduced the idea that the Properties palette is sort of like the Golf Caddy palette that will show you all the different functionality that Illustrator thinks you're going to need based on whatever it is you happen to be working on, right? Other palettes that we will use periodically, which I've opened up over here, is the Color palette, which is similar to the Color Picker but with less options. We are going to use the Stroke palette, which is this one right here, which allows you to change not only the thickness of the line around an object, but also the personality of the line itself. We are also going to look at the Pathfinder palette, which is this one right here, and the Align palette, which is right here. And of course our Layers palette is at the bottom. We will get into the Layers palette off and on in Illustrator, but you will find that the use of the Layers palette is not nearly as important as it is in Photoshop. The Layers palette is essential in Photoshop. Without it, you can't really do anything. In Illustrator, it's a useful tool and it's helpful to stay organized, but it's really not essential. And we'll see why as we go along, and maybe you've already figured that out. Now, the functionality of most of these palettes is also accessible directly from the Properties palette, but I kind of like to just have them open all the time so I can use them as I need them, as opposed to having to fish them out of the Properties palette. And I use the Properties palette as like a good starting point for a lot of different things, but you'll see as we go along. And then lastly is going to be the tool-specific menu, which runs along the top of the screen. So every time we pick a tool, certain things might change at the top that we need. Now, it doesn't change as much as it does in Photoshop, and that's because of the existence of the Properties palette. So you don't necessarily always see the tool-specific menu changing much. It really doesn't change much at all in Illustrator. A couple of extra functionalities will come and go depending on what you're using. But really, the big change comes over here in Properties, but we'll see that as we go along. Okay, then of course our workspace in the middle is this sort of white piece of paper that we're working with. And it doesn't really matter what size you're working on. This is really just for practice. You can do whatever you'd like. Okay, so I am going to start by turning the color picker back to its typical black and white, right? And I'm going to use the shape tools to start out with the rectangle tool. Now you'll notice when you pick a tool, pick the rectangle tool, your cursor turns into this sort of crosshairs, right? And this gives you a starting point to be able to click and drag out a shape. So with your mouse, using the left-hand button, you're just going to click and drag out a shape. Now, when it's active, you see this blue wire around it that sort of indicates the dimension of the shape. And of course, as I'm moving my mouse around, I can resize it and shape it from, a very thin horizontal rectangle to a very thin vertical rectangle to anything in between. And if I want to, at any point, I can hold down the Shift key and that will constrain it to a perfect square, okay? So the rectangle tool will become a square just by holding down the Shift key. Now you'll notice that as I'm sort of resizing it here, a couple things are happening. In the lower right corner, it is constantly telling me the measurement of the item. So right now my square is 5.5 inches by 5.5 inches. And as I move it around, that changes in real time. So that's super useful if you're trying to make it a certain size. But of course, don't worry about it. You can always change the size later. And you can even punch in specific numbers into the properties palette and make the square or the rectangle whatever size you want it to be. But it is helpful to know roughly how big it is as we are in the middle of making it, right? The other thing you'll notice is that aside from that blue wire on the outside that tells you the definition of the shape, you'll see a purple line that is what's called a smart guide. If I let go of the shift key and just go back to making rectangles, you'll see that pops up from time to time to tell me when I've accomplished something that is important, like, for example, a 45-degree angle. So as soon as I've done that, that purple line appears, which is basically telling me, hey, you've made a 45-degree angle between the two anchor points there. And smart guides also come in handy later on when you have other objects on the screen and you're trying to line things up in relation to each other. Okay, so the other thing you can do is while you are making something, notice this entire time I have not let go of the left mouse button, so it's depressed this entire time, right? I'm holding it down. So I haven't made anything yet. I'm in the middle of making it. The other thing you can see is in the center of this, there's a little blue X, and that is the center point of the object. And then if I want to, I can hold down the Shift key while I'm doing this, and I can relocate on the screen where I am about to create this. So that allows me to move it before I've even finished making it, right? So now I can move it up here and then let go of the Shift key and then continue to resize it. And then if I decide I really don't want it there, I can hold down the Shift key and do it down here now. Either way, you have sort of full control over how you're doing it. Once you're roughly happy with how you want to do it, you can let go of your mouse button and boom, it makes the rectangle for you. Now, as soon as it's made, it kind of locks it into place and a bounding box appears around that blue wireframe. Now, the blue wireframe remains. That doesn't go away. That indicates sort of the invisible border, right? But the bounding box gives us a bunch of control items. Now, bounding boxes, as we've talked about before, are control boxes. And to access the different controls, you just sort of hover over them. So the squares that are on the top and the bottom and the right side and the left side, those are known as anchor points, right? Anchor points also exist in the upper corners and the lower corners. So all four corners and all four sides have anchor points. Anchor points are represented by little squares, and those are control points, okay? The other control points are, of course, the little round dots that are in the corners, and you'll see when I point to them, you can see what they are. There's one over there, one down here, one down here. Now notice that as I'm moving my mouse around that the cursor changes. So if I bring my cursor out here away from the rectangle, it's just a black arrow with a little frame mechanism next to it, right, which indicates the bounding box. But if I hover over this corner anchor point, it becomes a double-sided arrow, which is cluing me into the fact that I can resize the rectangle by grabbing that anchor point. And you'll notice that I have sort of the ability to freeform it. I can make it tall, short, whatever. But if I were to hold the Shift key while I am resizing it, it will maintain its proportion, but just get bigger or smaller. So that's pretty useful, right? Okay, then if I bring my cursor over to the other anchor point on the top or the bottom or the sides, I also get the double arrow, but now I am simply just adjusting the height or adjusting the width by clicking and dragging it, okay? Now, next, if I bring my cursor slightly outside a corner anchor point, you'll see it now shifts to a rounded double-sided arrow. And that indicates that, hey, I can rotate this thing. So if I click and drag, now you'll see that I can spin my rectangle. Now you'll notice that as I'm spinning it, the degree upon which I am spinning it is showing up, right? So as I spin around here, it moves. So back to the beginning is at 0 degrees. And then if I work counterclockwise, it starts working its way upwards, right? And goes all the way around. And guess what happens if I go all the way around? Those of you who remember geometry class will know what's going to happen, right? And boom, I'm at 180 degrees. I just went all the way around. So now it's facing completely in the opposite direction. It's made a 180-degree turn. Now if I keep spinning it, it's going to eventually go back to the beginning, which 180 plus 180, of course, is, come on, geometry people, you know the answer to this, 360 degrees or back to 0. So that's how you rotate it. You go out to either corner, any of the corners, and just get that little double rounded arrow. Okay, now, of course, if I am hovering over these little control balls in the corner, now the cursor turns into a black arrow like it was before, but with a curve next to it. And then if I click on those and drag them inwards, the corners start to become rounded. And you can see the decimal indicator of how much I'm rounding it. So right now, these rounded corners, the diameter of them are 0.5 inches, which is a half an inch. And I can keep pulling it inwards and round it further and round it further and round it further until I've basically run out of the ability to round it. As soon as that happens, you'll see that the lines turn bright red. And that's Illustrator telling you, you can't go any further. That's as far as you can go. So now if I let go, the shape goes from being a rectangle to sort of this rounded pill shape, right? And then I can grab those control balls anytime I want and basically pull it back out again to any point in the rounding process until I get all the way back out to a full rectangle with pointed edges, pointed corners, right? Okay, so those are the different controls in your bounding box, right? You get anchor points, you've got the ability to rotate, resize, and round corners. Now, a good rule of thumb is that when you complete anything that you want to do with a shape or an object in Illustrator, don't leave the bounding box on. Don't leave it on like this, because if you leave it on, what you're basically doing is you're saying that that object is remaining active. Excuse me. So if the object remains active, that means that if I were to open up the color picker or go over here and just sort of, arbitrarily or accidentally click on any of the colors in my color palette, then I'm going to assign the color to the object that was active. And maybe I didn't want that to happen. Maybe I just wanted to kind of mess around with the color palette to try to mix some colors. So you want to make sure that you deactivate the bounding box before you go on to do something else, because otherwise you'll accidentally affect this object. So the easiest way to deactivate anything is to, and this is a good sort of rule of thumb and a thing you should probably always do when working in Illustrator, is after you've completed a task, go back up to your black selection arrow in the upper left corner, the selection tool, click on it. Now you're back to just your plain old selection arrow, and just click anywhere in some white space or off the document or whatever, away from your object, and that will deactivate the bounding box. Now once you deactivate the bounding box, I can now go back over here to, say, the color picker, for example, and I can mix colors all day, and it doesn't affect the rectangle because it's not active. Now that this is deactivated, you'll see that we can see what it was originally, right? It's a rectangle with a black stroke around it, a black line, and a white fill. Now, of course, it's tough to tell that because the paper is also white. But as I bring my black selection arrow around the rectangle, you'll see that those smart guides give me some clues, right? It tells me that this line that runs around it is called a path. And if I come to a corner where I know an anchor point lives, because I just saw it a little while ago, it says it's an anchor. And every time I land on an anchor, it will do that. And if I hover over the center, it'll tell me, hey, it's the center point. So those smart guides are really useful in that they pop up and give you information kind of all the time. And then anytime I want to pick this rectangle up and basically re-engage with it, I just click it, and the bounding box comes back, and then using my selection arrow, I can pick it up and move it around anywhere that I want. And of course, I can then go back and interact with the bounding box any way that I want. Okay. Now, this bounding box, or a version of this bounding box, and everything I just showed you about creating a rectangle, works on every single shape. Okay. So let's try some other ones, and we'll sort of see how that goes. So I'm going to leave our rectangle friend there, and we'll go back to the shapes, and I'm going to stay on the rectangle, but I am going to make a square. So to do that, I'm going to hold down the Shift key, and this way it remains perfectly proportionate as a square. And notice that as I drag it out, that purple line will pop up to tell me that, hey, I just made it the exact same height as the adjacent rectangle. So I know that they're both the same height now, right? So I'm done with the square for the moment. Go back to your selection arrow, unclick, and now boom, I got a rectangle and a square. Great. Now I'm going to go back over to the shape tools, and I'm going to grab the rounded rectangle tool. Now you're probably thinking, why do I need a rounded rectangle tool if I can turn any of these rectangles into a rounded rectangle? Well, and the reason for that is because the rounded rectangle tool existed in Adobe Illustrator before the ability to round an existing rectangle. That's fairly new functionality in Illustrator. They're always adding new things every time they come up with a new version of the software. And as I think I've told you before, Adobe is not really great at eliminating old functionality, so it does create a little confusion. But anyway, this creates a automatic rounded rectangle. And same idea, if I hold down the Shift key, I can create a rounded square. Okay, so that's those. Next on the list, we've got the ellipse tool. Now, the ellipse tool, of course, creates ovals or ellipses, and they work the same way. And similarly, if I were to not hold down the Shift key, I can make it sort of squished, you know, vertical, horizontal, whatever shape that I would like it. But if I do hold down the Shift key, it becomes a perfect circle, okay? And again, there's those purple lines telling me, hey, you've got 90-degree angles, which is a nice thing to say to somebody, really. So I'm going to make an ellipse, and we'll put that here, and then back to the black selection arrow. We'll drop that there. And then I'm going to grab the ellipse tool again, and this time hold down the Shift key and make a circle. Okay, so now we've got the circle. Okay, next, we're going to go down to the polygon tool. Now, the polygon tool is tricky because there's actually a whole bunch of shapes hidden underneath the polygon tool. So when you first click and drag it out, right, you'll see that it is a 6-sided polygon. It's a hexagon, right? And so hexagons are only one type of polygon. There's lots of different polygons. But how do I get to the other polygons, you're probably wondering. I'm sure you're dying to know. So while it is active, while I am still making it and I have not let go of that left mouse button, you can add or subtract sides to it. So on your keyboard, in the lower right corner of your keyboard, you're going to find some arrows. You'll notice that there's a left arrow, a right arrow, an up arrow, and a down arrow. Using the up or down arrow, you can use those to add or subtract sides. So like I said, this is 6-sided, so it's a hexagon. But if I were to hit the up arrow once, it adds a 7th side, and then an 8th side, so it makes it an octagon, a 9th side, a 10th side, 11, 12, 13, 14, so on and so forth. And if I keep adding sides, eventually it becomes a circle, right? Because now the sides are so small that you can't differentiate them. Now, conversely, if I were to hold the down arrow, I can subtract sides, and sooner or later here, this will go from being a circle to having some distinguishable flat-edged sides. There you go. So now I'm back to that. Now I'm back to my hexagon. But now again, that was our starting point. I'm going to hit the down arrow. Now it becomes a 5-sided polygon, which is a pentagon. Then a square, which of course they already exist up here. But I can do it here too. Which, by the way, you're probably wondering, hey, where's the diamond? Well, there's the diamond. Just simply turn your square on its side by 45 degrees and you've got a diamond. And if I hit the down arrow again, it becomes a triangle. I know you were worried about where the triangle was because it's not actually in the toolbox, but that's how you make a triangle. You just eliminate sides from a polygon. So I'm going to go back to making it its 6-sided thing here. Triangle. Wow, that's working way too fast. Okay, triangle, square, pentagon. There you go. And then I'm going to move this over here and resize it. And the Shift key in this case will keep it perfectly straight so that the top and the bottom are parallel and horizontal. So that takes care of that. But again, remember, I can go ahead and grab another polygon. And if I wanted to, I can make a triangle real easy and put that over here too. And like I said, you can make multi-sided polygons depending on whatever you would like. Okay, last but not least, now you're thinking, what about the flare tool? We're not dealing with the flare tool right now. All right, so the star tool. Star tool is similar. When you first start making a star, it becomes sort of your typical 5-sided star, you know, the prototypical 5-sided star. But just like the polygon, as it's being made while it's still active, you can go up or down with those arrow keys and add points. So it can go from being a 5-sided star to a 6-sided star, 7, 8, 9, 10, and so on and so forth until you make a multi-pointed star. It goes way up. But then conversely, if I go back in the other direction, I go back to the 5-sided star that I started with, and then keep subtracting sides, I can go to that type of star, if you're a Captain Marvel fan, or go back to the triangle. So both the star and the polygon eventually end up at a triangle, okay? But we're going to go ahead and let's leave it as a star burst. That's kind of nice. So we'll leave that right there. Okay, now the reason I made all these shapes is not because I'm trying to take you back to kindergarten here, although that is useful knowledge to have right now, is to show you that the bounding box that results from each of these shapes is a little different, right? So we talked about the one in a square and the one in a rectangle, right? All the anchor points, the different functionality built into it, the ability to round the corners, right? All those fun things. But then, of course, when you go to the rounded rectangle, it works almost exactly the same. In fact, you can round those corners further, right? You can keep going with that, which is kind of great. And you can round it more or less depending on what you would like. Notice that when you're talking about a square or a square rounded, if you pull that all the way in, it becomes a perfect circle because, of course, it's proportionate on all four sides. So those red lines pop up, and now it's a complete perfect circle. So that's another way to get to a circle, right? But then if we get to the oval or the circle, you'll see that it eliminates some of the functionality and adds some functionality. So here, it eliminated the rounding button. I can't turn this into a rectangle. It does have the anchor point that I can squish it and make it bigger. I can make it taller or shorter, and I can come out to the corner and rotate it just like I could with the rectangle and the square. But it also has this new functionality, which is a little blue lever that pops up, which you might think is a rotation tool, but it's not. Watch what happens. If I grab that and start going in one direction, it opens it up like a pie chart. So now it's creating sort of a divided circle or oval, which allows you to create a whole new shape. See? So you can do that. You can create a portion or a section of it. And once you've separated them, you get two of them. So now I can pick it up from either way. So that's a new way to make a shape. So if I go to the circle, same thing. There's that tool. And look, I can make Pac-Man. Monka, 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 monka. Okay, so you get the idea. So now when you go to the polygon, you do get the rounded button, which allows me to round the corners of the polygon. And same thing works even if you're in triangle mode. I can round my triangle, so that works nicely. But the other thing I can do in the triangle and the polygon is it adds this little diamond right here, which is really hard to see. It just sort of pops up, but that allows you to, now that it's already made, add or subtract sides. So I can go from a 6-sided to a 4-sided to a 5-sided. Go back in the other direction and just keep changing the amount of sides by dragging that diamond up and down, right? Pretty neat. Go all the way down to a triangle. So this is adding and subtracting sides, works on the triangle too. So that's another new piece of functionality that is only germane to the polygon, right? And then you get down to the star, and the star actually has limited tools. It really just has the anchor points to resize it or to rotate it, but there's no other fun new tools. But either way, each of these basic shapes has a specified kind of bounding box attached to it that allows you to resize it. Okay, the next thing I want to show you is that you'll notice that everything we made when we were clicking and dragging it outwards, I'm going to go back to the rectangle here, I clicked and dragged it from the upper left corner down to the lower right corner. All of them work that way except for the polygon. The polygon works from the center outwards a little bit differently. However, you can make all of them work from the center out. Go back to the rectangle by simply holding down the Option key on your keyboard, and then your crosshairs cursor gets a little bit of a frame around it. And now if I click and drag, I can make a rectangle from the middle outwards as opposed to from the corner downwards. So it's just a different way to go ahead and create it, right? Which might come in handy. And again, if I hold down the Shift key while doing that, it'll be a perfect square. So now I'm engaging 2 fingers on the keyboard, one for the Option key, one for the Shift key. And then I can also go down to the space bar and move it while I'm making it. So down to 3 fingers on the keyboard. So that's sort of referred to as the claw method, which works out pretty good. Okay. All right, now, of course, any of these shapes can be manipulated, deleted, moved, any way you want. Once you've made them and you go back to your black selection arrow, all you gotta do is click them and they become active. And not only can you engage with the bounding box, but if you decide you don't want one, just click it and then simply hit the delete key on your keyboard and it's gone. Simple. You can also pick them up and move them, right? Move them around pretty easily, overlap them so that they are in different orders. They're laying on top of each other, so now they become a collection of shapes that are interacting with each other. You don't have to select them one at a time. If I wanted to select a couple of them, I can choose one with my black selection arrow, hold down the shift key, and then click another one, and then click another one. And I can pick them up and move them as a set, like that. I can also pick them up and move them even if they're not touching each other. So I can grab this guy, hold down the shift key, grab this guy over here, and move these guys together, like that. And furthermore, if I wanted to lasso them together, I can do that by simply grabbing my black selection arrow and clicking anywhere in the white space away from them and click and drag a lasso around all of them. And now I have a whole set. Pick them up, move them around as a set. Now, if you want to permanently attach them together in a way that you can then use them later on as a set, I can grab, for example, this polygon and this triangle, and if I go up to Object and go down to Group, notice the keyboard command, right? Control or Command G. Those are now grouped together. So now if I just grab the triangle and move it, the polygon comes along for the ride. They're a set. They're now grouped together. So I don't have to double select them at that point. They are a group. Now, even if I wanted to interact with one of them by themselves, I don't have to ungroup them, although you can, right? If I click the group, go up to Object, go down to Ungroup, and again, notice the keyboard command, Shift Command G or Shift Control G. That ungroups them, so now if I grab the triangle, it functions by itself. But even if I still had them grouped like that, I can simply double click on one of them, and you'll see up here in the upper right corner of your document screen that it shows me that I am now inside the group, right? And notice that these guys got grayed out, and these two are active. So even in doing that, now I can work with the triangle separately. But if I move it over here and then hit that back arrow a couple of times, now I'm back out onto the main screen. Notice that the group continues to be a group, even though I've relocated the triangle. So the group stays engaged, right? Makes sense? Okay, so that is that. Now the next thing we're going to talk about is the direct selection arrow. So to do that, I'm going to get rid of a few of these just because I got too many things on the screen right now. And we'll sort of talk about how the direct selection arrow works. So let's stick with a rectangle and a star. That'll be helpful. I'm going to make this rectangle a little bigger, make the star a little bigger so that we can kind of see what's going on here. Okay. Now, we saw our anchor points, right? So these are anchor points in our bounding box. But independent of the anchor points, each object, every time that the line that makes up the object changes direction, it drops sort of what we'll call an internal anchor point, right? These are separate from the bounding box. These are the anchor points that are attached to the actual objects. And you'll notice that if I hover over different points, the word anchor pops up, right? See, there's one there. There's one there, so on and so forth. But they're kind of invisible. You can't see them. However, if you grab the white arrow, which is the direct selection tool, and you hover over any of those points where you know there's an anchor, see, now it becomes visible. See that little white square that popped up? So that's an anchor point. Anchor points are kind of like nails that have been driven into a cork board, and then these lines, these paths, are almost like you're stringing a piece of wire between the different nails, right? And that's sort of how this is made up to create my square here. Now the direct selection arrow, if I just pick up the square and move it around, kind of works exactly like the black selection arrow. I can even round the corners. So you're probably thinking, well, what the heck is the difference between the black selection arrow and the white selection arrow? Well, the difference is that if I hover over that anchor point with my white selection arrow with the direct selection tool and click it, now watch what happens. I can move the anchor point. I can pick up that nail from the pegboard, right, just to push the analogy further, and I can relocate it on the pegboard. So I can turn it from a square to some other brand new shape. And now that I've activated one anchor point, the rest of them will work too. Kind of neat, right? So you can have full control over the shape itself, going from what it was, from a square, to something entirely new. Now that works, of course, with anything that has anchor points, which is anything that has angles, right? So over here in the star, I can grab this anchor point and relocate it like that. Relocate this one, relocate this one, relocate that. So you can totally change the look and tone of an object by picking up those anchor points and relocating them. Kind of neat. Okay, so next we're going to look at coloring our objects, right? So we talked about the color picker, and we're going to talk about how to do that. So I'm just going to go back to the rectangle here because it's a nice simple shape to work with. So the star that got mangled here we're going to get rid of. We'll hit delete. Goodbye, star. All right, so back to the black selection arrow as usual. Go back to the rectangle, and I'm going to enlarge this quite a bit so we can get a pretty good look at it. Now, one thing you might have been paying attention to as we're making all these changes with the different shapes on the screen is that the properties palette over here has been changing like crazy every time we click on something. So that is sort of like the new tool-specific menu, as it were, even though we still have the tool-specific menu up at the top. So let's take a look at both the properties palette and the tool-specific menu right now with the rectangle. And then we're going to talk about coloring, okay? Now, everything we're going to go over now applies to all shapes. It doesn't really matter, but I figure we'll stick with the rectangle just because it's easy enough to understand. And there's a lot of redundancy here. There's a lot of functionality that you're going to find in multiple places. And like I said, Illustrator and Adobe in general is not great at eliminating old functionality when they introduce new functionality. So you as the user, you sort of get to decide what tools you like to use and what tools you don't want to use. So let's just point this out immediately. So with the black selection arrow chosen and the rectangle turned on, we can see the bounding box. So if we go across the top of the tool-specific menu, you have a pull-down menu that accesses the swatch palette. Swatches are sort of pre-mixed colors. Picture it like sort of the Crayola box of crayons, right? You're limited to these colors. We'll talk more about the swatch palette when we get into color in Illustrator a little later. But just so you know, these, as you click them, will change the color of your fill. Now notice that as I'm clicking the different colors, not only does it change here, but it's also changing down here in the color picker box. And it's also changing over here in the properties palette over in the appearance section. So 3 ways to skin a cat, right? So I can go through the variety of colors here and change them, right? Next, on the tool-specific menu, there's a pull-down menu for the stroke color. Now, the stroke color is that line that is around the object. So again, I can add different stroke colors by clicking the different colors. But if I don't want a stroke color, or also if I didn't want a fill color, over in the upper left corner here, there's that universal symbol for none. It's that red line slashed through a space. And that, of course, gives me no stroke. Now, if we go down here to the color picker and take a look, you'll see that the fill color remains, but then the stroke color has that red slash through it because that's what I chose up here. I also could have clicked on the red slash color down here in the color picker, right? And, of course, it's reflected over here in the properties palette. So, like I said, redundancy, lots of redundancy. Now I'm going to add a stroke weight to it just so a stroke color to it just so we can see it. We're going to put a red on here. But then the next thing in the tool specific menu is the stroke size. So I can increase the weight of that line by simply clicking upwards with the points, or I can go in here and type in whatever point I want. So if I know I want it to be 18 points exactly, I can type that in, hit the tab key on my keyboard, and it becomes an 18-point stroke. Or I can hit the old pull-down menu, and there's a bunch of pre-made sizes here. I can change it that way. Now that's just the weight of the stroke, but if I wanted to access some of the personality of the stroke, I can click the word, and then that opens up a floating stroke palette. So this allows me to do a couple of things. I can change the cap in the corner of the line. So you'll notice that right now it is sort of flat and pointed, right? And if you hover over them, it gives you the actual names, like this is a miter joint and this is a butt cap. But then I can turn it into a rounded cap and a rounded corner, and looks what happens. It kind of gently rounds the corner of the lines. I can also give it sort of an angular edge by clicking those two. So you can change the personality of the line that way. The other thing you can do is align the stroke differently. So remember I told you about that blue wire that sort of acts as the frame for the shape? You notice that that's still there, right? You can still see that blue wire along with the anchor points in the bounding box. Well, the line, you'll notice, goes a little bit in one direction from the blue wire and a little bit in the other direction from the blue wire, so it's centered. But you can change that alignment over here and shift the line further inwards or further outwards based on its relationship to the blue wire frame, okay? Or you can just leave it centered, either way. Now, what if you don't want a straight line? You don't want a straight stroke all around it. What if you want a dashed line? Just simply click off the dashed line, and it gives you a dotted or a dashed line. And then you can change the personality of the dotted or dashed line by changing the size. By default, the dash is 12 points wide, and then the gap is also 12 points wide. It's automatic. But I could change that. I could make the dash, say, 20 points wide, and I could make the space in between it, say, 40 points wide, and then that changes the personality of the dotted line. And I can do this all day. We could change it a bunch of different ways. So if I want to make it tiny, I could make it the dash only 5 points and make the space, say, 10 points, and then I get that kind of a line. And you can play around with the different sizes to sort of get the type of dashed line that you want, right? Now, if you don't want the dashed line anymore, you can simply uncheck it, and then it goes back to being a solid line. Now, this doesn't work on a closed shape like a square or a rectangle, but if I just had a plain line, which we will get to later when we learn about the pen tool, that'll be next week, you can add arrowheads to either end of the strokes. So you can see there's a whole collection of arrows and tails and shapes and whatever that you can add to your strokes, both the beginning and the ending. So that's another thing you can do here in the stroke palette. And then the last thing is sort of the look of the line, right? So right now it's a perfectly uniform straight line, but if I go to this pull-down menu, you'll see that there's different kinds. So if I click this, now you'll see that it goes from thin to fat to fat to fat to thin, right? Or if I click this one, it changes a little bit more, or this one, a little bit more. So this is as if you were using a different type of pen to draw the line. It gives it a little more sort of visual personality, as it were, as opposed to just a uniform line all the way around, right? And then if you do pick one of these, you can flip the way they look by using these reflect buttons, right? So that's that. So that's sort of the profile or the look of the line. Now, like I said, redundancy, you'll notice that a lot of these tools are also appearing over here in the properties palette. I can access that same stroke palette over here if I want. I can access the fill over here if I want. I can change the weight of the stroke over here. So you can get to this stuff in a few different places. All right, so moving along. Now back over here to the tool-specific menu, that same thing we were just looking at also exists in a pull-down menu here, which changes the personality of the line weight. So it's not only in the stroke palette, but it's also up here. And I can also add something else, which is the type of pen that is used to draw the line. There's not a ton of choices. It's not like the paintbrush tool over in Photoshop that gives you a whole ton of brushes to choose from. Here in Illustrator, you've only got a few choices. You've got the basic one, which is automatic, but then you can add a rounded one that looks like that, a different rounded one, an angled rounded one, a few others, and then the one that is kind of popular that a lot of students like is the charcoal one that gives the edge kind of a ragged charcoal-y look. And then there's some weird decorative ones like this one here and this one here. And this one is really bizarre. It's like a denim border. I have no idea why this exists in Illustrator. You can add other ones. You can go to New Brush and add new ones, but these are the default ones that come with Illustrator. It's a weird collection of pens, I gotta tell you. The basic one and these rounded ones up top are usually the ones you'll end up using most of the time. Okay. And notice that when you go back to the basic one, it brings it back down to a thin line again. Okay, next is opacity. You can adjust how much you can see through this shape, right? So right now it's at 100%, so it's entirely opaque. You can't see through it at all. But if I were to go to the opacity slider and grab it and go downwards, I can make my rectangle look more and more transparent, more and more see-through, until finally it just disappears entirely. Now it's still there, right? You see that blue wireframe and my bounding box still exist. So it's there, it's just hiding from you. So it doesn't go away, you're just making the colors more or less transparent. So it's not the structure of it, it's just the colors. And you can do that, of course, a couple of ways. You can also type in a number. So if I want to make it 50% transparent, just type in 50, hit the Tab key on your keyboard, and there you go. Okay, and again, you can access opacity over here in the Properties palette. You can also access the opacity palettes by clicking on this, and this not only gives you access to those exact same controls, but also the blending modes. You remember those from Photoshop, right? The blending modes? Same blending modes. These are photographic visual adjustments that will impact the way your colors look when they're sitting on top of other objects, okay? So you remember those from Photoshop, you remember them from here. Next, we have styles. These are about different fill styles, and just like the pen tools, they're equally as strange in that there's a handful of pre-made ones, like this one, which is really interesting, or this one, which is also really interesting. And you can add other ones, and you can create new graphic styles, but the ones that come with it are a little on the bananas side. Anyway, we're going to leave it right there because why not? It's kind of cute. Okay, now there's other tools up here, including the alignment palette. You can also change the size of your object by punching in numbers here. So if I want this rectangle to be exactly 9 inches by exactly 5 inches, I can just type that in, and now it's the exact size I wanted it to be. But you can also do that over here in the Properties palette. I can do the width and the height over here. And if I want to maintain the proportion, I can click the chain in between them, so that now if I change it from 9 inches to 10 inches, it will automatically adjust the height to go with it, so it maintains proportionality. But again, you can access all this in the Properties palette too, right? You can adjust the angle here in the Properties palette, which is something that is not available up here in the Tool-Specific menu. And that allows you to angle the object by simply changing the angle that's chosen here and putting it like that. You can also flip the object back and forth. Okay, we're going to deal with the align options, which again you can access here in the Tool-Specific menu, but you can also access them here in the Properties palette a little bit later. We're also going to get into the Pathfinder later on, so we'll talk about all that stuff later. For now, I just want you guys to play around with all the shape tools, make a bunch of shapes, play around with coloring them. Definitely mess around with the direct selection tool so you can go in and grab some anchor points and reshape something and turn it into something entirely different. And maybe try to draw a couple of objects by combining shapes into different things, right? Like if there's one thing you know you can make with shapes, it's a snowman, right? You can do that. So we could grab some ellipses and we could simply, make a round and make another round and make another round and boom, instant snow person. Anyway, mess around, see what you can come up with. So again, selection arrow, direct selection arrow, a whole collection of shapes, all of the adjustment tools in the tool-specific menu, as well as the ones that repeat themselves in properties that give you access to colors for both the fill and the stroke. So play around with it, see what you can do. And we are going to get more into these shapes and whatnot a little later in the week. Remember, also, there's more lessons here in Adobe with these various videos. Play around with those. Those will help get you up to speed. We're going to deal with the Vector Basics quiz later in the week. And at the end of the week, we're going to introduce our new project. All right, keep practicing, and I will talk to you soon.